Have you ever had the feeling of being followed? Not the dramatic kind, not the footsteps behind you in a dark alley, not a figure in your rearview mirror. The quiet kind. The kind that starts as a prickling at the back of your neck and builds slowly over days into a certainty that something is behind you. Something that keeps its distance. Something that doesn't want you to know yet. Most of us dismiss that feeling. We're sensible people. We live in a world that has good explanations for most things, and we've learned to reach for those explanations first and reach for them hard. But some of the people who send me their stories, the ones who write at 2 in the morning, the ones whose messages arrive in fragment sentences because they're still not sure how to put them into words, they tell me that feeling didn't go away when they dismissed it. It got closer. Tonight I have 3 stories about things that follow. Things that choose, things that are patient and deliberate and have already decided where they're going to end up. The first story comes from Shining Rock Wilderness in North Carolina, a trail that most hikers finish without incident, a campsite that most people leave in the morning and never think about again. Most people. My name is Paul. This is Voices from the Vale. Stay close to the fire. The thing at Camp 7. I've hiked the Shining Rock Wilderness maybe a dozen times over the years. It's a beautiful piece of backcountry. High elevation, open rocky balls, views on a clear day stretch so far you start to feel like the world is showing off. The rock itself, a massive outcrop of white quartz that gives the wilderness its name, sits just under 6,000 feet and catches the light in a way that seems almost deliberate, almost like it wants to be seen from a distance. I love that place. I want to say that clearly before I tell you what happened there, because I still love it, and I still go back, and I need you to understand that what I'm about to describe did not come from the wilderness itself. It came from something that was in it that shouldn't have been. This was 4 years ago. September, shoulder season. The summer crowd's gone and the fall colour just beginning to show at the higher elevations. I'd planned a 3-night solo camping trip in the Artlope Trail, a loop around the high balls, out the same way. I'd done variations of this route several times. I knew the terrain. I had good gear, the weather window was solid, everything about the trip was routine right up until the second night. I made camp at a spot I'll call Camp 7. Not the official name, just what I call it. A flat area just below the ridgeline with a fire ring that's been there so long the stones have sunk halfway into the ground. Good wind shelter, good drainage, a reliable water source 20 yards down slope. I'd camped there before. It was a known quantity. I set up, made dinner, sat by a small fire as the dark came down off the ridge and the temperature dropped the way it does fast at elevation in September. The kind of evening that makes you remember why you do this. Stars coming out hard and clear, the fire small and good, the silence of high country at night, which is a different silence from the silence of the valleys, thinner somehow, like it has less between it and whatever is above it. I went to my tent around 9. I was tired from the day's miles, and I was asleep quickly. I woke at 2:17. I know the time because I looked at my watch immediately, the way you do when something wakes you in the dark and your body needs an anchor. 2:17. The fire long dead, the tent dark, the temperature dropped hard. I lay still, and I listened. Something was walking around my tent. Not an animal. I've camped enough to know the sound of a bear nosing around a campsite, the heavy tentative quality of it, the sniffing, the way it bumbles rather than moves with direction. This was not that. This was a steady, deliberate circuit of my tent, footfall by footfall, close enough that I could hear the difference between when it was on the dirt of the campsite and when it crossed over onto the flat rock of the tent's edge. I counted the steps, in the way that your mind does in crisis, that it wouldn't do in calm. I've counted the steps automatically, cataloguing, trying to make data out of what my body wanted to simply flee from. The circuit took 19 steps. Each time it completed the circuit, it began again immediately without pausing. 3 circuits, 4 circuits, 5 circuits, steady and rhythmic and unnerving, like something performing a ritual or something that had decided the tent was the center of a boundary it was marking. I did not move. I did not make a sound. Every piece of conventional wisdom about wildlife encounters was running through my head, and none of it felt adequate because this was not a wildlife encounter. On the 7th circuit, it stopped, directly behind my head. The footsteps stopped at the head of the tent, and the silence that followed was the particular silence of something that is standing still, which is different from the silence of something that has already gone. You can feel the presence in it, the weight of it, something occupying space just beyond the thin nylon between you and the outside. I lay there. I felt it standing there. I did not move. I did not breathe more than I had to. Then it put its hand on the tent. Not a paw, a hand. I know the difference between a paw pressing against tent fabric and fingers pressing against tent fabric. And these were fingers. 4 distinct points of pressure and the heel of a palm, pressing down slowly with deliberate force against a nylon 6 inches from my face, pressing inward, the fabric deforming towards me, the shape of a hand visible in the nylon in the faint ambient light. I stopped breathing entirely. The hand pressed for a long moment, then it withdrew, slowly. The fabric easing back, the pressure gone, then footsteps again, resuming the circuit. One more time, then retreating, moving away from the campsite up towards the ridgeline, the sound fading into the distance, and then gone. I lay in that tent until first light, did not sleep, did not move, lay there in my sleeping bag with my knife in my hand, which I understood even at the time was not adequate to whatever was outside, but which my hands needed to be holding. And I watched the darkness around me, and I waited for dawn. In the morning I broke camp fast. I didn't make coffee, didn't eat, just packed and moved. Before I left, I looked at the ground around the tent. There were marks in the soft dirt, a circuit around the tent, marks that were not animal tracks and were not boot prints, something between the two, fully like neither, a shape I didn't have a reference for, spaced at a walking pace, going around and around a tent in a pattern I had heard in the dark. I photographed them. I have these photographs. I've shown them to people who know tracks, and none of them have told me what made them. I finished a hike out that day, and I drove home and told myself it was over. It wasn't over. The first time I noticed it following me, I was 3 weeks home, standing in the grocery store of all places. Ordinary Tuesday evening, fluorescent light and music, and the particular unreality of a supermarket after dark. I was standing in an aisle, and I felt it. The prickling at the back of my neck, the certainty of eyes on the back of my head. I turned around. The aisle was empty except for a woman with a cart 20 feet away who was looking at soup cans and paying me no attention. I told myself it was nothing. I finished my shopping. I drove home. In bed that night, I heard footsteps on the deck outside my bedroom, a steady circuit of the deck, corner to corner, the boards taking weight in a pattern. I knew the way by sound, by position, by the particular voice of each one. This was not the right pattern for a person or an animal moving naturally across the deck. This was the same deliberate circuit I'd heard at Camp 7, the same 19 steps, or close to it. The same rhythm, the same quality of something making a boundary with the place. I was sleeping at the center of it. I did not go to the window. I lay in the dark and counted, and sat and waited, and eventually the steps stopped. At the head of the bed, on the other side of the wall, directly behind my pillow, I felt the stillness of it standing there, and I thought about the thin nylon being replaced by drywall and insulation, and I thought about whether that was a meaningful difference. And I decided it was, and I held on to that thought very hard for a long time. In the morning I found the marks on the deck. Same shape, same circuit. It followed me from Shining Rock. 3 weeks later and 100 miles away, it had followed me home. I've done a great deal of reading and a great deal of asking since that September. I've talked to other people who hike the Shining Rock Wilderness, put the word out quietly through hiking forums and trail groups, and I've found 3 other accounts of something similar. Not identical, different details, different circumstances, but the same essential shape. Something encountered a high elevation in the backcountry, something that circled the campsite at night, something that in at least one other account followed the hiker home afterwards and was heard outside their house in the weeks following the trip. I haven't found an explanation. I've found folklore. Old Cherokee accounts of high elevation spirits, things that live on the balls and don't welcome intrusion, things that mark you if you camp in the wrong place and follow the mark home. I've found these accounts and I've found them more comforting than any rational explanation I've been able to come up with, because at least they acknowledge that thing exists. At least someone else saw it, named it, warned their people about it. The circuits around my house stopped after about 6 weeks. Just stopped. The way they had at Camp 7, without explanation or event. The marks on the deck stopped appearing. The feeling of being watched faded. Mostly. There are still nights when I wake at 2 in the morning and lie still and listen. Nights when the silence outside has just that particular quality of occupied space, of something standing just beyond the wall. On those nights I don't get up. I don't look out the window. I count, slowly, until the silence changes, until it feels empty again. And on the nights when I count to 100 and it still doesn't feel empty, I count to 100 again, and I hold very still, and I wait for dawn. Six weeks. It followed him for 6 weeks before it stopped. Before it seemed to stop. He's careful about that distinction. Seemed to stop. Because there's no way to know for certain whether it left or whether it simply got better at being quiet. That's the thought that I can't put down after that story. Not the hand on the tent, as visceral and terrifying as that image is. Not the circuit of footsteps in the dark, but the idea that something out there in the wilderness, something that lives in the high balls where the trees stop and the rocks start and the wind comes down unobstructed from whatever is above, something like that can decide you're worth following, can decide you're worth 100 miles between a campsite and a bedroom, can decide for reasons we don't have access to that you specifically are interesting enough to follow home. What made him worth following? Was it something he did at the campsite? Something he said or didn't say or should have known not to do in a place like that? Or does it choose randomly? Does it walk that ridge and wait for whoever camps in the wrong spot on the wrong night and mark them? Follow them? Is there anything any of us could do not to be chosen? I don't know. What I do know is that the next story suggests strongly that sometimes you don't have to go anywhere to bring something home. Sometimes something finds its way to you through an object. Something that was in a place that went into a thing that was in that place and came home with it the way the smell comes home in your clothes. Invisible, patient, already inside before you know to close that door. The story comes from a woman in Roanoke, Virginia, an antique she bought at an estate sale, a mirror that had been in a house in the mountains for over 100 years, a mirror that showed her things that weren't in the room. This is the silver glass. The silver glass. I want to tell you that I am not the kind of person who buys haunted objects. I know that sounds exactly like what a person who buys haunted objects would say, but I mean it in a specific way. I've been going to estate sales and antique markets for 20 years. I have a house full of other people's old things. Furniture, ceramic, glassware, textiles, the accumulated objects of other people's lives that found their way to me through that particular commerce of debt and dispraisal that estate sales represent. I'm not precious about it. I don't feel the weight of providence in the way some collectors do. An old thing is an old thing. It has a history, but the history isn't mine, and I've never felt it pressing against me through the object. Until the mirror. The estate sale was in a farmhouse outside Floyd County, Virginia, October 2 years ago. One of those crisp, brilliant October days that make you feel like the world is performing for you. The farmhouse had been in the same family since the 1800s, and the contents reflected that, layer upon layer of accumulated living. Things that brought and things inherited and things made and things kept for reasons that were no longer clear to anyone still living. The kind of sale that takes place all day if you're serious about it. I found the mirror in an upstairs bedroom, propped against a wall behind a cedar wardrobe, half hidden, like it had been put there deliberately out of the way. It was large, maybe 4 feet tall and 2.5 wide, in a frame of dark walnut that was plain and well made, the kind of craftsmanship that suggests someone who knew what they were doing and wasn't interested in showing off about it. The glass itself was old, the silver backing aged to a warmth that new mirrors don't have, slightly uneven in a way old glass is uneven, with a quality of depth to the reflection that modern mirrors lack. It was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, in the understanding way of things made to last rather than to impress. I asked the woman running the sale about it. She was the granddaughter of the deceased, handling the sale herself, and when I pointed to the mirror, her expression did something complicated that she smoothed over quickly. She said it had been in the house as long as anyone could remember. She said it had always been in that room, always against that wall, always somewhat out of the way. She said, and she said this lightly with a small laugh that was doing work to keep something at a distance, that her grandmother had kept it turned to face the wall for at least 20 years of her life, and nobody had ever asked her why. I should have registered that more than I did. Looking back, I registered it as mildly interesting, a piece of the object's character, the kind of detail that makes an antique more compelling rather than less. I bought it, brought it home, leaned it against the wall of my front hallway where I decided where to hang it. That night I woke at 3 in the morning from a dream I couldn't remember, and I lay in the dark feeling wrong in the way you feel wrong when something has happened that your waking mind hasn't processed yet. A residual of disturbance, an emotional weather that had no specific source. I got up for water, walked down the hallway in the dark past the mirror. I didn't know what made me look at it. Habit, maybe, the way you glance at a mirror when you pass one. A reflex of self-checking so ingrained it operates below the level of decision. I looked at the mirror. The mirror showed the hallway behind me. It showed me the hallway correctly. The walls, the door at the end, the table with the lamp on it, all correct, all exactly as it should be, except for the figure standing at the end of the hallway, behind me, in the reflection, standing at the far end of the hallway between the table and the door, still and dark and person-shaped, standing in my hallway, in the mirror version of my hallway. I spun around. The hallway behind me was empty. I turned back to the mirror. The reflection showed an empty hallway. I stood there for a long time. Then I went back to bed and I lay in the dark and told myself it was the dream residue, the wrong feeling dark. My eyes making shapes out of nothing the way eyes do when they're asleep, soft and the light is low. I almost believed it. It happened again 4 nights later. This time I was passing the mirror in daylight, mid-morning, full light from the window at the end of the hall. No ambiguity about visibility or waking states. I passed the mirror and glanced at it from habit and saw myself reflecting, and behind me, in the reflection, at the far end of the hallway, the figure, same position, same stillness, dark and person-shaped and standing in a reflection of my house that was identical to my house in every detail, except for the thing standing in it. I turned round. Empty hallway. Turned back. Empty reflection. Gone in the time it took me to turn and turn back. I took the mirror down that afternoon, and put it in the basement and told myself I was being sensible and managing a situation rationally, and that an old mirror with aged silver could produce optical artifacts that the brain interpreted as shapes, and this was a known phenomenon, and there was nothing wrong with my house or my hallway or my waking mind. That night I heard footsteps on the basement stairs. I'm going to be honest with you about what the following 3 weeks were like, because I think the honesty matters more than making this a clean story. The 3 weeks after I put the mirror in the basement were the most frightening of my adult life. Not because of dramatic events. There were no dramatic events. There was no confrontation, no climax, no moment of crisis. There was instead a slow, grinding accumulation of wrongness that was almost worse than a single terrible thing would have been. The figure in the mirror appeared every few days, always in the reflection, always gone when I turned around. I moved the mirror twice, back upstairs, then to a closet, and it didn't matter. The figure was in whatever mirror it was near. Then it was in other mirrors, the bathroom mirror, the small decorative mirror in the kitchen, the reflection in the dark glass of the oven door, always at the far end of whatever space the mirror reflected, always still, always watching. I stopped looking at mirrors. I covered them. I took the decorative one off the kitchen wall and put it in the closet with the antique, and I put a towel over the bathroom mirror, and I ate breakfast looking at the wall, and I felt, during those 3 weeks, like I was losing my grip on something essential, like the ordinary fabric of being at home in your own house was being pulled loose, one thread at a time. The footsteps on the basement stairs came every night, always stopping at the top, never coming through the door. I slept with the bedroom door locked. I understand how that sounds. I understand that a locked interior door is not meaningful protection against most things, but it was the only action available to me that felt like the agency, and so I took it and I held onto it. On the 19th night, I was awoken at 3 in the morning by the sound from the hallway. Not footsteps, a different sound, lower and continuous, a sound I lay there trying to identify for a long time before I placed it. Breathing. On the other side of the door, close to it, right up against it, the slow and patient breathing of something that was standing at my door in the dark and was not in a hurry and had nowhere else to be. I lay there for 40 minutes listening to it breathe. Then I got up and I unlocked the door and I opened it. I don't know why. I've asked myself that question many times, and the answer I keep coming back to: minutes I'd burned through something, some resource of fear that once exhausted left a residue of decision. I was more afraid of one night of this than I was of whatever was on the other side of that door. The hallway was empty, but the door to the basement was open, standing fully open, which had not been when I went to bed. Open and dark, and at the top of the stairs, the darkness below it complete and total. I went to the basement door, and I stood at the top of the stairs and I reached in and I turned on the light. The mirror was on the bottom of the stairs. Not where I had left it. I had left it leaned against a far wall face inward. It was at the bottom of the stairs, upright, facing up towards me, like I had been moved there, like I had been placed there deliberately, facing the stairs, facing the door, facing me standing at the top with my hand on the light switch. I looked at my reflection in it from the top of the stairs. The reflection showed me standing at the top of the basement stairs. It showed the stairs and the basement behind me and the door frame and the hallway behind it. And behind me, at the far end of the hallway, exactly where it always stood, the figure, but different this time. In every previous appearance it had been standing still, standing and watching and motionless. This time it was closer, not at the far end of the hallway, halfway down it, standing halfway between where it always stood and where I was standing, looking at me in the mirror. As I stood there at the top of the stairs, looking at its reflection, looking back at me, it took a step towards me. I slammed the basement door. I went back to my bedroom and I locked the door and I sat on the bed with every light in the room on and I did not sleep. And in the morning before it was fully light, I carried that mirror out of my house and I put it in the car and I drove to the same road in Floyd County where the estate sale had been. And I left it at the end of the driveway of the farmhouse where I'd bought it. I don't know if that was the right thing to do. I've thought about the next person who might find it, the next person who might be drawn to the old walnut frame and the warm depth of the aged silver glass. I've thought about that and I haven't resolved it. What I know is that when I got home that morning and went through my house uncovering the mirrors one by one and looked into each of them, the hallways were empty. The figure was gone. For 3 weeks, I had lived in a house with something in its reflections that was getting closer, one appearance at a time, getting closer the way it had gotten closer down the hallway in the last reflection, methodically, incrementally, one step at a time. I think if I had kept it one more night, if I had stood at the top of those stairs one moment longer, it would have reached me. I think about that old woman keeping that mirror faced against a wall for the last 20 years of her life. I think she knew. I think she found out the way I almost found out. I think she was wiser than me. She kept it turned away. She never let it see her. She never let it see her. 20 years of a mirror faced against a wall. 20 years of knowing what was in it and making the single daily decision that kept it contained. Don't let it see you. Don't give it the reflection it needs to find its way to you. And then she died, and her things were sold, and someone found it beautiful and brought it home and took that containment apart without knowing it existed. I think about that a lot. How many objects are there right now in antique stores and estate sales and the back rooms of old houses that are contained by a decision a dead person made and never explained to anybody? How many old mirrors and old wardrobes and old chairs and old clocks are sitting quietly in places where someone's last act was to turn them away or lock them up or nail them closed? And how many of them have already been moved, already bought, already brought into a home where nobody knows what they're carrying? The first story tonight was about something that followed a man home from a wilderness trail, something he encountered in a place and decided he was worth the journey. The second was about something that came home inside an object, something that had been in a house for 100 years, contained by the wisdom of someone who knew what she had and released the moment that wisdom died with her. The third story is different from both of those. The third story is about something that doesn't follow a person. It follows a family. It has been following this family for 3 generations. The grandmother saw it first, then the mother, and now it has come for the daughter. And the daughter knows something the grandmother and the mother didn't know when it came for them. She knows it's coming. She's known her whole life, and knowing has not helped. This story comes from Watauga County, North Carolina, a family that has lived in the same valley for 140 years, a thing that has known where to find them for every one of those years. This is the patient one. The patient one. My grandmother called it the tall man. She saw it for the first time when she was 19, standing at the edge of the tree line behind a house in Watauga County where she'd grown up and where she'd lived her entire life. She was hanging laundry in the early morning and she looked up and it was there, tall. She always emphasized the height, always the first detail she gave. Taller than any man she'd ever seen. Taller than the height a man's proportions allow for without something going wrong with the result. Standing at the edge of the trees with its hands at its sides, looking at her across the yard. She dropped the laundry. She stood there and she looked back at it. She said later that she didn't run because she understood in that moment, with a clarity that bypassed thought and went straight into the body, that running was not the right response. That running would mean something she didn't want it to mean. She stood her ground. She looked at it, and after a long time, she thought perhaps 5 minutes, standing in the early morning with the wet laundry at her feet, it stepped back into the trees and was gone. She told her mother that evening. Her mother went very quiet and then went to the kitchen and stayed there for a long time before she came back and sat down and told my grandmother something that her own mother had told her. That the women in their family saw the tall man once, at the beginning of their adult lives. Then it came to the edge of the tree line and it looked at them and they looked back. That this had been happening in their family as long as anyone could trace it. That nobody knew what it wanted. That nobody knew what it was. That it had never, not once, in all the generations anyone could account for, come out of the trees. My grandmother held on to that. She lived her life, she raised her children in that valley, in that house, under the eyes of those trees. She grew old. The tall man did not come back in her lifetime, or if it did, she never spoke of it again. Then my mother turned 19. My mother's encounter was different from my grandmother's, and the difference scared my grandmother badly enough that she left the house for the first time in 40 years and went to stay with her sister for a month. My mother saw it at the tree line the way my grandmother had. The same morning quality of light, the same extraordinary height, the same stillness. She stood and looked at it and it looked back at her. But this time it was closer than the tree line. My grandmother had always described it at the edge of the trees, 20 yards from the yard, clearly visible, but clearly contained within the boundary of the woods. My mother saw it at 10 yards, past the tree line, past the border in the woods and cleared ground of the yard, standing on the glass in the early morning light, in the open with nothing between it and the house. And this time, it didn't stay for 5 minutes. It stayed for 2 days. Not clearly visible, it came and went, appeared and disappeared. But over the course of those 2 days, my mother saw it 6 times, from the kitchen window, from the upstairs bedroom, once from the back porch at dusk, closer than any previous sighting, close enough that she could see it, or thought she could see it. She was always careful about what she claimed certainty of, that its face was wrong, that the proportions of the face were wrong in the specific way, that the proportions of the body were wrong, like something that understood the compounds of human face and had assembled them with precision but without understanding what made a face rather than a collection of features. On the second day it came to the back porch. My mother heard the boards take weight. She was in the kitchen and she heard the boards and she knew from the weight and the spacing of the steps that what was on the porch was not a person and not an animal. She stood in her kitchen and she did not go to the door and she did not look out the window and she held onto the counter and she prayed. Then the steps came to the door. Stopped. Silence. Then a sound she has described to me many times and that I've never been able to fully visualize from her description. A sound against the door. Not a knock, not a scratch, something between the two and fully like neither. A sound like something pressing its face against a wood the way you'd press your face against a cold window on a hot day. A sound of contact, of closeness. Then the steps retreating. Off the porch, across the yard, back to the trees. It didn't come back that time. My grandmother came home from her sister's. The two of them sat at the kitchen table and they talked about it for a long time. And what came out of that conversation, what my mother eventually told me, was that my grandmother was frightened. Not by what had happened, but by what it meant about what would happen next. She said, "It's getting closer every generation." She said, "Your grandmother before me saw it at the tree line. I saw it at the tree line. You saw it in the yard on the porch." She looked at my mother across the table. She said, "When it comes for your daughter." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I turned 19 in November. I knew it was coming. I'd known my whole life it was coming. The way you know things that have been in your family so long they've become part of inheritance. My mother told me when I was old enough to hear it, told me carefully and completely, told me what my grandmother had told her and what her grandmother had told her. She told me what it looked like and how tall it was and the way it moved, and she told me about the porch and what she'd heard against the door, and she told me, her voice very steady, her hands very still, the way she gets when she's keeping something in, that it would come for me and it would be closer than it has ever been before. She told me what I had to do, what the women of her family had always done. Stand your ground, look back, don't run, don't open the door. I turned 19 and I waited. It came in January. I was in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, the winter dark still full outside the windows, the yard invisible beyond the glass. I had the light on over the stove and I was making coffee, and I was trying, as hard I'd been trying every morning for 2 months, to simply live my life and not wait. I looked up at the window over the stink. It was standing in the yard. I want to tell you about the height, because my mother and grandmother had both told me, and I had thought I was prepared, and I was not prepared. There is something about the height that is wrong on a human body. Not gigantism, not the proportions larger of a tall person, but a height that is in excess of what the human frame is designed to produce, what it looks like when something has been extended beyond its natural limit. There is something about that specific wrongness that the body receives as a threat so fundamental and so old that there is no preparation for it intellectually. You see it, and your body knows something is wrong before your eyes have finished reporting what they've seen. I held onto the counter. I looked at it. It looked at me. It was at the edge of the yard, not the tree line. The edge of the yard where the mowed grass met the rough ground before the trees, maybe 15 yards from the kitchen window. Closer than I had been from my mother. Closer than the porch. I stood there and I looked at it and looked at me, and I thought about it for 4 generations of women in this kitchen, in this house, in this valley, and I thought about the distance closing generation by generation, and I thought about my grandmother's unfinished sentence across the kitchen table, and I held onto the counter with both hands, and I did not look away. Then it moved, not towards the tree line, towards the house. One step, slow and deliberate, closing the distance by maybe a yard, then stopping. I stopped breathing. It stood there at that new distance, still, looking, then another step. I want to tell you that I held my ground. I want to tell you that I did what the women before me had done, that I stood in the kitchen and looked back and did not run and did not break. I want to tell you that. I ran. I left the kitchen and I ran upstairs and I went into my mother's room and I woke her and I told her, and she went white in a way I had never seen on her face before, and she held my face in her hands and she looked at me and said, "Did it reach the house?" I said I didn't know. I said I'd run before I could see. She closed her eyes, held them closed for a long moment. Then she got up and she went downstairs and I followed her, and she went into the kitchen and she stood at the window and she looked into the yard. The yard was empty. We stood there together in the kitchen in the early morning dark and we looked out at the empty yard and the tree line beyond it, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Then my mother pointed at the ground outside the kitchen window, at the yard, visible now in the growing light. Tracks coming from the tree line, crossing the yard, coming to the window. Coming to the window and stopping there, under the kitchen window where I had been standing. It had come to the glass while I was running upstairs, while I was waking my mother, while the kitchen was empty. It had come all the way to the glass and stopped there and looked in. And when it found the kitchen empty, it had gone back to the trees. That was 8 months ago. I still live in the house. My mother is still here. We talk about leaving and we have not left, and I think we understand without fully saying it that leaving is not the answer, because the answer to something that has followed your family for 140 years is probably not changing a dress. I go to the kitchen window every morning. I look out at the yard, the tree line before I do anything else. Most mornings the yard is empty. The tree line just tree line, and I make my coffee and I live my day. But some mornings, the light is wrong. The shadow at the tree lines are deep, and I stand at the window and I look very carefully at the edge of where the trees begin, and I think about distance, about how much of it is left. My grandmother at the tree line, my mother in the yard, me at the window. One generation left before it and the door, maybe less. My mother's unfinished sentence across the kitchen table. When it comes for your daughter. I think about that sentence every day. I think about what comes after it. I think about what happens when there is no distance left to close. When it finally reaches whatever it has been walking towards for 140 years. What it does then. What it has always been coming here to do. I don't know. I'm 20 years old. I have time to find out. I just don't know if that's a comfort or the most frightening thing I've ever heard. I have time to find out. 20 years old, 4 generations of women, 140 years of something closing the distance one generation at a time. Patient beyond our understanding of patience, deliberate beyond our understanding of deliberateness, and a young woman standing at a kitchen window every morning looking at the tree line, waiting, not for it to stop coming, just to see how close it is today. I've thought about all three stories tonight and the thing they share, the thing underneath all of them that I keep coming back to. In the first story in the wilderness, chose a man and followed him 100 miles home and circled his house in the dark for 6 weeks. In the second, something lived in a mirror for over 100 years, contained by the wisdom of a woman who never explained it herself, and waited patiently for that wisdom to die so it could begin walking down a hallway towards someone new. In the third, something has been walking towards the same family for 140 years and has not hurried and has not stopped, and it is almost there. 3 stories, 3 different kinds of following, at the same terrible truth at the center of them. Some things have decided where they're going, and the distance between where they are and where they're going is not a problem for them. It's only a problem for us. That's the thought I'll leave you with tonight. Not to frighten you, or not only to frighten you, but because I think it's worth sitting with. The idea that patience like that exists, that there are things in the world that have chosen a destination are simply walking towards it, one increment at a time, completely unbothered by how long it takes. It puts our own sense of time in a different light and makes the distance between us and the things we can't explain feel smaller, more temporary, like a gap that is closing whether we're paying attention or not. Pay attention. That's all any of us can do. Pay attention and keep the lights on and listen to the sounds in your house make at night and know which ones are right and which ones are wrong and act accordingly. And if something has been following you, if you've felt it, that prickling certainty of something behind you closing the distance you can't measure, don't ignore it. Don't tell yourself it's nothing. The woman in the farmhouse told herself it was nothing. The man at Camp 7 told herself it was nothing. 20 years of mirror faced against the wall told us exactly how much nothing was. My name is Paul. This has been Voices from the Veil. I'll be back with a new video soon. Same fire, new shadows.